It is 7 o'clock in New York. It's 4 o'clock in Los Angeles. Yesterday, on September 10th, the conservative activist Charlie Kirk, a 31-year-old husband and father of two, was assassinated while speaking at Utah Valley University. Shot from a sniper from 200 yards away, Kirk became the latest victim in what can only be described as America's descent into political violence. The tragedy struck on the eve of the 24th anniversary of September 11th. That's a day whose wrenching memory once served to strengthen the bonds of American membership. But each year since 2001, the memory of those Islamist attacks grows fainter, and the rival ways in which we remember 9/11 itself has come to represent a kind of civic division. Some Americans are even willing to countenance the idea that 9/11 was somehow our fault and that we deserve them. We mourn Charlie Kirk and we remember the 9/11 attacks this year together. My name is Jonathan Silver. I'm the Warren R. Stern Senior Fellow at TICFA and our Chief Programming Officer. For those of us who watched Charlie Kirk rise, his death carries a particular kind of sting. At only 31, he was somebody many of us witnessed growing up in front of our eyes, building something organic and grassroots and genuinely impressive from really nothing more than conviction and courage. TICFA is not a partisan institution, and we are less forwardly political than Turning Point USA, but I think that Kirk served as a model for many of our students, a model of what courage in the arena looks like, standing up for Israel and the Jewish people, even when it's difficult and even when it's costly. Kirk's murder is, of course, not an isolated incident. It follows a deeply disturbing pattern. The attempted assassinations of Donald Trump, the shooting of Democratic lawmakers in Minnesota, the firebombing of Governor Josh Shapiro's home, the near miss at Justice Brett Kavanaugh's residence. Each attack represents another fissure in the foundations of our civil society. We understand that political violence is horrible, that it corrodes the very basis of our democratic order. But I was talking to a friend earlier today who reminded me of this fabulous letter that Tolkien wrote to his son during the darkest days of World War II, in which he wrote that so short is human memory and so evanescent are its generations that in only 30 years there will be few or no people with direct experience, which alone goes really to the heart. The burnt hand teaches most about fire. We live in a generation that has largely forgotten the lessons of our predecessors, learned through blood and suffering about where political violence ends. I want to mourn Kirk tonight, but I also want to hear the profound questions that his assassination asks of us. Questions about America's future, about our responsibility as Jews, as people of faith, as patriots to prevent our nation from sliding further into the abyss. To help us reflect on these questions, I'm joined, of course, by my friends and the very distinguished voices, Liel Leibovitz of Tablet magazine, Shabbos Kestenbaum of PragerU, and Noah Rothman of National Review. Together, we're going to explore what Charlie Kirk's life and death mean for the future of our country and our community. Noah, I want to begin with your commentary, blockbuster commentary essay that's now being sketched out even further into a book in which you trace the political left's embrace of violence back to Seattle in 1999. I'd like you to help us understand how Charlie Kirk's assassination is part of this broader pattern.
Of course. Thank you, Jonathan, for hosting us, and thank you to the TICFA Fund for this important conversation. The piece in question, Clockwork Blue, how the left came to embrace political violence, goes right to the heart of what we've witnessed over the last gut-wrenching 24 hours. It's important to note that we don't have a suspect. We do not have a motive. And yet, it is almost immaterial considering the reaction to this event that we have witnessed over the course of the last 24 hours from not just left-wing activists, but members of the political class, some of whom are in good standing, or at least were. And that speaks to the incentive structure that exists within the Democratic firmament, the far left firmament. Democrats in general should be far more reluctant to embrace these individuals than they are, because there's no love lost on the progressive left side of this equation. The reaction is very similar to what we saw with the murder of Wesley LePatner. She was an executive on Park Avenue who was murdered by a psychopath who thought he was meting out revenge against an executive with the NFL who had slighted him in his own mind. That was a senseless act of bloodshed, but it was lent sense and rationality and justification by those who want to see romantic revolutionary violence against the symbols, what they believe are the symbols of the capitalist enterprise. It's a very familiar sort of revolutionary violence, not distinct in my research from periods of violence that erupt roughly every half century in this country. We had a similar one in 1860, 1870, 1910, 1920, 1960, 1970, 2010, 2020. And it is akin to what we witnessed after the murder of Brian Thompson, United Healthcare CEO, by Luigi Mangione, who found his face gracing prayer candles, who was celebrated at concerts, who found himself condemned by Democratic lawmakers, but only not afterwards. They appended a very pregnant but onto their condemnations. Bernie Sanders, Chris Murphy, Elizabeth Warren, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But you have to understand where he was coming from. But you have to understand that there's so much anger at the healthcare system. But you have to understand America is broken. Its justice system is broken. Its election system is broken. Its banking system is broken. We are broken. And you create there a permission structure to lash out at the fundaments of the American experiment, because you're inculcating a sort of fatalism in the true believers, those who don't understand the game that is being played on you here. This is just for mobilization, right? You're not supposed to be moved to violence, but some do take it literally. And when they take it literally, they resolve to attack the foundations of this wholly immoral system that is deaf to what they believe to be the highest moral ideal. And so you end up radicalizing a fair amount of people who are not just deranged. Derangement is not the common thread. It is the romantic attachment to revolutionary politics that is the through line. And the violence that we witnessed throughout the country after October 7th is illustrative of the progressive left to which the Democratic Party is beholden, the progressive left's attachment to violence, and the extent to which the Democratic Party itself is not allergic to that sort of thing. So we had endless examples of vandalism, of harassment, of menacing, of attacks on Jews and non-Jews alike, perceived Zionists. And what was the response from the highest echelons of the Democratic Party to their own torment at the hands of these people? Well, they have a point, Joe Biden says. Well, they're displaying exactly the right emotion, Kamala Harris says. Well, they're civically engaged, her vice president, Mr. Walz, says. The Democratic National Committee was attacked on November 2023 by a raving mob. Policemen were injured. They tried to enter the building. They wanted the heads of Democratic lawmakers, said as much. One Democratic lawmaker from Illinois said, "We were rescued by police." And yet, up to Halloween of 2024, days before the vote, the Associated Press reported that Kamala Harris was seeking to, quote, validate the concerns of the protesters in order to harness them, direct them, use their energy to her purposes. We've incubated this out of a misguided sense that the violence that we've witnessed is useful, politically useful, and there has been a lot of violence. We had since 2022 alone, and you can go back, I went back to 1999, I go back further. Just take it from 2022. The attempt on Brett Kavanaugh's life, 2 attempts on Donald Trump's life, the attempt on Lee Zeldin's life, the attacks on crisis pregnancy centers, the attacks on Republican staffers, including Marco Rubio's staffer, who was attacked because he was a Republican staffer, and on and on and on. It has only grown. And it is not just a left-wing problem. It is a right-wing problem. And I suspect it will be more of a right-wing problem, because once you study these sorts of attacks, this sort of activity, in the minds of those who conduct them, they are not meting out some sort of violence ex nihilo. They are avenging a slight. They have a vendetta that they are pursuing. Mm-hmm. These people take inspiration from the violence on the other side and justify their own actions from the violence of the other side. And that's what we're staring in the face of right now. An endless cascade, a sequence of reprisals and retribution that does not end without catastrophic bloodshed. It needs to be arrested now, and it needs to be arrested only, in my view, by naming the nature of the threat. In periods of history, there are times where right-wing violence is dominant and times where left-wing violence is dominant. This is one of those times where left-wing violence is dominant. And if we do not speak openly and honestly about the nature of the threat, we will not see it put to bed.
No, you have just explained how there have been eruptions in the past when then, like now, political violence has been intellectualized and justified in elite circles. What I want to ask you is what makes this time different? How is 2025 different than those previous examples?
It's different in some ways. Well, there's differences in a lot of ways. The first one that jumps to mind is that this is marginally less terrorizing than previous cycles of mass violence like this, because 9/11 happened. And because 9/11 happened, we put a lot of legal restrictions on access to explosives and detonators. Previously, bombs were the weapon of choice for the political terrorist. And if we had not had 9/11, I think we'd be seeing a lot of bombs. The fact that we don't have that doesn't necessarily make this any less menacing, but it does limit the amount of deadly damage that can be meted out. In terms of the psychology that we're fighting, I think it's much worse than the 1960, 1970, even early 1980 wave of violence, because there was an elite culture at the time that was just appalled by violence in the streets, by the bombing campaigns, by the assassinations. There was no superstructure and intellectual framework that justifies this sort of thing. It existed among far left radicals, individuals who were attracted to Marxism themselves or co-opted by Marxist elements. And that just didn't have a ton of purchase in the early 1970s like it does now. Right now, there is broad grassroots appeal in the sentimentality and romance of a Marxian social contract. Because, as you said at the outset, the memory is gone. The collective memory has disappeared. We're a generation now removed from the collapse of Soviet communism in Europe. So the mistakes of the past are eagerly being repeated by those who do not know the past and are frankly contemptuous of the past.
Well, Liel, this is highly related to the question I wanted to put to you, which is that there is a level of political analysis that is extremely valuable here, but of course it is not sufficient. There's something much deeper at work, a kind of spiritual and moral crisis that this is a symptom of. And I want to ask you if you can reflect on that. What kind of broader social and moral context do you think is necessary for us to understand what happened?
What you're saying is you want it darker, to quote our great Rev. Leonard Cohen.
Right.
Look, far be it from me to disagree with my smarter and imminently better dressed colleague, Noah Rothman, who I think hits many of the right points. But I think kind of chalking it all up to some kind of romance is seeing, to quote another great poet, looking at a rug from the opposite side and trying to ascertain the patterns. As I write in a piece that will run tonight in Tablet Magazine, everyone can subscribe. It didn't happen, the assassination of Charlie Kirk, in a vacuum. It was no freak aberration. Charlie Kirk was shot because great forces spent decades reshaping social norms and institutions and creating vast cadres of Americans ready to do great violence to anyone that they believed was their enemy. Like every complicated question, this one too contains multitudes and takes a lot of time to unpack. But I want to start somewhat irresponsibly, because I'm responding now to reports and rumors that have not been confirmed that on the assassin's rifle were slogans supporting transgender movements and saying that this is a comeuppance for Charlie Kirk's stance against this thing. I think it is actually, whether it turns out to be true or not, an incredibly important point to make. When you spend decades going to war against the very notion of embodiment, a fundamental foundational human concept, when you tell human beings that though biologically speaking, every cell in the human body is coded according to specific sex chromosomes, that is but a construct that gender could override. When you say there are 57 genders and you're free to choose your expression on every day, what you are doing at that moment is that you are creating a whole swath, an entire generation of broken, wrecked human beings. Human beings who then go on to mutilate their own bodies. Human beings who then do not have children, or for that matter, don't have sex. In 1990, this is one of my favorite prurient statistics, 55% of Americans reported having sex at least once a week. The number in 2022 was 37%, and among Gen Zers, according to the Kinsey report, 1 in 4 reported never having had sexual intercourse with another human being, which is why we're now at something like 1.6 births per women in America, which means we're far, far, far below the replacement rates. This is not a coincidence. This was done to us by people who control schools, by people who control the media, by people who've erected a very large power vertical that then taught society how to think. And that's just one example. Quote unquote, criminal justice reform is another example. When you unleash and release hundreds of thousands of vile animals into the street, people with prior convictions, people who are violent, evil individuals. We love to talk about mental health crisis. We do not have a mental health crisis in this country. We have an evil crisis in this country. And when you release these evildoers, people who have made evil choices and done evil deeds into society because you would like everyone to believe that policing is the new Jim Crow or that prison is the new slavery, well, then you have set up an entire social structure in which the question isn't whether violence would occur, it's when. Not because there is a small but growing, I disagree here with Noah, cadre of romantic Marxist revolutionaries who've sort of gobbled up these ideas and are happy to implement them, but because society at every turn has come under attack. And the attack isn't just on the nature of our political discourse. The attack is on what it means to be an American. The attack is on what it means to be a human being. And I think that that's the bad news. Here's the good news. The good news is that this is America. And I cannot stress how angry I am and how sad I am to have lost a man I admire greatly and came to know a little bit before his death. But I can also not stress how optimistic I am that this great country that has been through far worse has the tools, the gumption, and yes, I love that Tolkien quote, the institutional memory to go ahead and use these tools to crack down on this power vertical and break it from every direction and in any which way and return America to what it used to be. And in this case, there will not just be justice for Charlie Kirk, but this will be a true turning point for America.
You know, Liel, it makes me think the way that you reflected on criminal justice reform and the reluctance that so many of the elite have to enforce the law puts me in mind of one of Ruth Weiss's famous and favorite phrases that kindness to the cruel is cruelty to the kind. And we have to, it should stiffen our spine to enforce the law as it is.
It should absolutely do so, and I'm glad you provided the requisite Ruth Weiss quote. I would have done it myself otherwise. I think every Jewish event should contain at least one tribute to our great teacher and rabbi. But I think the point of this approach is not just having good and sturdy enforcement. I think the point, the larger point that I would like to stress is that this problem isn't going to get solved unless we identify the whole extent of who and what the culprits are. And it's very easy to say, well, it's a bunch of deluded Marxists on college campuses, or, oh, well, it's people affiliated with this country, this party or that party. By the way, I agree completely with Noah that sadly, tragically, it is very likely that at some point very soon, we are going to see some hot-headed conservative person say, well, if they've done it, then we could do it too here. Now I'm going to shoot, God forbid, this person or the other. But to me, those are aftershocks. The great big thing that we need to recognize, the actual problem that we're dealing with, isn't this sliver or that sliver, etc. It's this entire power structure built up by the Democrat Party, paid for by people like George Soros, supported by labor unions and by NGOs of all stripes, and encouraged and accelerated by academia and the media. It is an entire torrent of civilizational collapse and decay that was meant to turn us into a different society. Enforcing the laws, that's one thing, and it's a tremendous tool. I think, for example, that the judge out in Charlotte, North Carolina, who released a filthy animal who is attacked 14 times on 14 different occasions, released him because he wrote a note saying he will come back to his hearing. That person, who then went to go ahead and massacre this innocent, wonderful Ukrainian refugee on the trial on the train. I think that judge should be in prison right now. We need to start actually upholding the law, not having some kind of civic society debate, but actually saying to these people, we're sorry, but you are the barbarians. And it is the duty of every great empire to protect itself from the barbarians that wish to destroy it.
I would jump in there because I've been invoked often.
With love
of
and
course.
admiration.
I certainly wouldn't dismiss Rousseauian romanticism as liberally as you do, Liel. I think that is in direct contravention of a Lockean Enlightenment social contract, which is the foundations upon which democratic society, Western liberal society, is based. And to simply suggest that it's beside the point, I think, is dismissing what is foundational and elemental to the philosophy that we're arguing against. Second, if we were to establish for ourselves a daunting task that involves dismantling power structures at every possible area of American society, cultural, educational, governmental, it's pretty intimidating. In fact, it's something that I think a lot of people would shrink from. It is not that deep and profound. It is not a civilization-wide crisis we face here. As you just suggested, we can start with enforcing the law. That's a pretty narrow objective that can be easily remedied. The Progressive Prosecutor Project, which is in its death throes right now. It is not dead, but it is nowhere near the strength and menace that it represented in 2019, 2020, is receding. And it is receding as a result of a backlash, a popular, organic, grassroots backlash against the kind of theory, a romantic theory that was pursued by individuals who invert victim and victimizer, who perceive victimizer to be victim themselves because they exist in a wholly immoral society that is arrayed against their interests, and we don't invest enough money in this, that, and the other thing. That's a sort of thing that we can that's not even on the margins. That is something that can be dismantled and done away with in ways that would make profound differences in individual people's lives. You start there and you build from that. You don't set yourself up with the task of a multi-front war against every facet of society because you'll lose it.
Yeah, Liel, I want to come back to you, but I want to invite Shabbos into this conversation. Shabbos, you've spoken about how, as somebody who yourself has built up this kind of following among college students, you have spoken at these massive crowds. Charlie Kirk is somebody that, as an activist yourself, you've learned from, and you wrote that his assassination has radicalized you. I want to know what your experience was and what you meant by that.
There is no one in our contemporary political culture who cared more for America's youth than Charlie Kirk. Just no one. My dad was a Lubavitcher Chassid. He raised us modern Orthodox, but he has very fond memories of being part of the Chabad movement. And after Gimel Tammuz, when the Rebbe passed away, there was a profound sense of what do we do now, of feeling lost. And I'm not drawing a comparison, of course, between Charlie and the Lubavitcher Rebbe. What I am saying is, for a significant amount of America's youth, Charlie Kirk was the closest thing they will ever have to a Hasidic master. This is someone who not only gave political advice. You can watch his debates, watch his speeches on college campuses. Students were asking him questions not merely on tariffs and economic policy, but on the type of woman they should be looking for in a relationship, on when it's the right age to start a family, on blessings for material success. And I feel, and we, millions of young people, feel like we are sailing without a captain. This is someone whose loss will go down in the pantheon of American history, the same way that people remember where they were when JFK was assassinated. I was backstage at the Republican convention the first time I ever met Charlie, and I had commented to him that I felt a bit nervous right before my speech. And so matter of factly, he said, "So long as you are telling the truth, you have nothing to fear." And that's exactly who Charlie was. He was a man of great conviction who stood for his convictions and quite literally became a martyr for free speech. And there's a real discussion going on now in the conservative circles. I work for PragerU now, in the conservative circles that I inhabit, of do we continue to do these events just from a safety perspective? And in a sick, cynical, but wholly unsurprising way, it is not at all a shock that this assassination took place on a college campus, because what were once bastions of the freedom of thought, of intellectual diversity, have become inhospitable for divergent viewpoints. Why is it that every time Kristen Hawkins or Ben Shapiro or Matt Walsh or Michael Knowles go on a college campus, they need to wear a bulletproof vest? Why is it they require dozens of armed guards? It's because our cultures of institutions of higher learning and the college campuses have created such dangerous environments to have a divergent viewpoint. And that's what makes Charlie such an anomaly and so endearing to millions of Americans, young people in particular, who felt that he was their voice. And another thing that really speaks to me is Charlie on his worst day, at his most evil, was him expressing ideas you didn't like. That is his worst crime. You know, he was not someone who stole. He was not someone who violated the law. He did not rob or murder. He said opinions that you did not agree with. And if the response to saying opinions you do not agree with is a bullet to the head, then perhaps you are on the side of bad ideas. And as Noah mentioned earlier, it's time to call a spade a spade. This is affecting one particular political ideology in our country. It just is. The Foundation for Individual Rights and Expressions, FIRE, an American NGO, they released on Monday their new rankings for free speech on college campuses. Roughly a third of American college students believe that violence is appropriate. Violence is appropriate to stop a speech on campus that you do not like. A third of American college students. Noah mentioned Luigi Mangione. Every single age demographic in our country condemned the assassination of Brian Thompson, the United Healthcare CEO, with one notable exception: 18 to 24-year-olds, because we have been fed a diet of political indoctrination that if you rank high enough on the victimhood Olympics, then you have carte blanche freedom to do whatever it is you would like to rid yourself of that oppression, which is why you are seeing young people on TikTok or Blue Sky or Twitter celebrating, lauding what happened to our friend Charlie. It is a sickness, and it is a sickness that can be traced directly to institutions that have normalized, that have accepted, and have celebrated a culture whereby if you don't get your way, if someone issues a microaggression or offends you, you can murder them. You can literally kill them, which is why on the night of October 7th, not 5 months after the fact, on the night of October 7th, you had 34 student groups at Harvard blaming Jews for the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, which is why you can go to my classmates, you can go to my professors, and they will literally tell you, as they've told me, resistance is justified when people are occupied. And unfortunately, Charlie, who was our voice, who was our hero, who was the captain of our ship, is the next victim in this way too long of a line of unspeakable political assassinations.
Shabbos, I saw Ben Shapiro announce today that he intends, quite forthrightly, to pick up the microphone that that was knocked out of Charlie's hand, and wants to now aggressively continue campus appearances. I wonder if you all at PragerU, or you yourself, Shabbos, have given thought to what his death means for the future of campus activism and political engagement by conservatives on campus.
So it happens to be my mom is on this call, and she's very worried about me, but I am speaking on 3 campuses this coming week. And obviously we are taking different security precautions for those campus talks. But my attitude, Ben's attitude, and the attitude of the conservative movement is we are not going to change our behaviors, our attitudes, our actions to accommodate other people's bigotry, hatred, discrimination, or inability to recognize that there are other people who disagree with your ideology. So do I see Lincoln-style debates happening in our country, no, I think that era is over. I think things will have to be inside. Things will have to be screened. One of the things that the Jewish community post-October 7th has been doing, which is an unfortunate necessity, is they'll only reveal the location after the fact, after you've RSVP'd and they've screened your social media. I wish that wasn't the case, but that is the case. So security measures will be increased. But overall, Charlie Kirk has inspired tens of millions of Americans, and you are going to see not the next Charlie Kirk, because unfortunately that is not replaceable, but you will see a significant amount of young American conservatives picking up the mantle, because we have our marching orders. And I think this is where the analogy to Chabad works quite well, because Chabad Hasidim, after the death of the Rebbe, honed into what made them different, honed in onto what made them a unique Hasidic group. And American conservatives, they have their marching orders from Charlie to defend Western civilization, to not only talk about free speech, but to act upon free speech, to defend the promises of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. At the same time, though, we are in mourning not merely because we lost a friend, not merely because we lost Charlie, but we also know we will never have another Charlie again. He was a once-in-a-generation figure who spoke to you as if you were the only person who mattered. And I just want to make one last point, and I'm sorry I'm sort of rambling, but this is actually the first time I've spoken about it publicly. Yesterday, when we heard the news, there were all these rumors circulating, and I had watched the video, and my mind was telling me it was over, but my heart didn't want to believe it. And at PragerU, we have a couple of million followers on social media, and we felt that it would be appropriate to model what Charlie lived by, which is an attachment to Judeo-Christian values, an attachment to organized religion. And so we took to our social media and we went live, and I recited both in Hebrew and in English chapters from the Book of Psalms. As we were getting ready for the live, literally as I was in the chair, an internal email went out from Turning Point USA confirming the worst. And for just the briefest of moments, for about 10 seconds, there was a theological debate. Namely, do we go live? Do we continue to recite a chapter from the Book of Psalms knowing that it's over? And the reason I say that this debate was the briefest of debates is because we realized that we weren't simply praying for one man. We were praying for an idea. We were praying for everything that Charlie represents. And I say represents in the present tense, because all of the things that he had fought for have become even more important now than it really ever has been. And especially, I'm sure you'll get to this later, if you're in the pro-Israel, pro-Jewish camp, it's a very, very daunting time, because he was so outspoken, and uniquely so. He cared so deeply about the land where Jesus walked. He encouraged millions of Christians to return to Christ. He encouraged millions of Jews to defend Israel more passionately than he did. I mean, he was just such a unique, warm, Bible-loving man. And as I said, we're not just mourning him, we're mourning that there will never be another him again.
So I do want to actually raise the question of Charlie's outspoken statements, about Israel and the Jewish people. Liel, I want to come to you first, but this is really a question for everybody. I would say that as I was paying attention to him, especially since October 7th, Charlie Kirk positioned himself largely as a defender of Jewish interests and of the state of Israel. Now, there were people in the Jewish community that criticized him for platforming figures like Tucker Carlson and engaging with some of the, frankly, wacky conspiracy theories. And I would say that my observation is that his apparent strategy was that by providing fora for debate, even uncomfortable debate, it would serve as a release valve against an even more dangerous, more pernicious attempt to squash that debate. And I guess, Liel, I don't know if you agree with that observation, but if you do you think that was an effective approach? What should we make of that strategy?
I think it was a tremendously effective approach, and I'm sad to say that I believe it might have been precisely the approach for which Charlie Kirk paid the steepest price. I think, first of all, again, I was saddened but not at all surprised to see too many in the Jewish community fail to realize the depth and candor of the friendship that Charlie Kirk had with the Jewish people. You should read Israeli mainstream media today. Let's just put it mildly, they're not flattering. But I think that is in large part because they failed to understand the mission, just like those who criticized him for quote unquote engaging with people whose opinion he disagreed with. I think Charlie Kirk understood, and again, I did not have the privilege of knowing him quite as well as I would like to have known him, and I was a long time admirer of his. But one thing that struck me and continues to strike me is that the motivating principle behind the work of Charlie Kirk wasn't necessarily, free speech. We talk a lot, especially in moments like this, about free speech and due process, democracy. But tragedies like the one we witnessed today remind us that free speech, due process, democracy, any other number of things that we hold so dear, these are not stand-alone virtues. These are not abstractions to be revered independently of their function. They're simply safeguards designed to help us keep the society we want, which Noah very correctly pointed out was this Lockean, the society based on these Lockean principles, society predicated on a very specific set of assumptions and expectations. And when people no longer share these assumptions, when they abuse the very safeguards designed to keep us thriving, then our society will collapse unless it manages to defend itself from the barbarians who are no longer at the gates, but well in the house. One of the greatest moments that is now repeated again and again, as sort of sadly what we're seeing the posthumous highlight reels of Charlie Kirk, is him saying, when we stop talking, that's when civil war starts. I mean, the quote itself is beautiful. He said, in a marriage, when you stop talking, you get to divorce. In a society, when you stop talking, you get to civil war. I think he understood very, very well that free speech wasn't some, oh well, it's a reflex. I could stand here and say whatever I want, including, all these horrible, horrible, horrible commies on campus who dressed up as Satan, or one girl who deliberately had her nipple exposed so that the whole exchange will not be able to be carried out on YouTube based on their decency rules. Those kids were missing the point. Charlie Kirk got it right. We talk to everyone. We do so with respect. We do so with firmness. We do so with humility. But we do so based on the notion that our goal is to get to the shared common principles in which we all believe and on which the society is predicated.
Noah, Shabbos.
Just a brief thought that is related but tangential. One reason why I'm generally optimistic about the future of this country, but one reason I'm certainly pessimistic in the short term is that I find that a lot of the philosophy that animates those who are moved to individual and mob action, direct action, as Black Bloc demonstrators would call it, that sort of socially destabilizing behavior, feel that they have no other option because they have been robbed of agency. Liel mentioned trans ideology, which is not the same as being transgender. There are individuals who are transgender who do not subscribe to transgender ideology. I don't think Deirdre McCloskey, for example, subscribes to transgender ideology despite being transgender. Nevertheless, one of the central tenets of transgender ideology is the supposition that society is out to kill you, that you are besieged by forces outside of your control. They are nebulous, ill-defined, and yet omnipotent, and they are out to get you. So preemption is justified, rational, indeed logical. And it's a sort of thing that'll move, and you've seen it for decades. It's one of the reasons why Matt Iglesias left Vox, is there were figures over there who felt unsafe around him, because he was going to mete out some sort of physical punishment. So this sort of ideology, and I think you see it elsewhere across the spectrum of left-wing demonstrators who engage in violence, is that they perceive themselves to be acting preemptively in their own defense in a self-defensive manner because of the imminent nature of the threat to them from forces all around them. And conservatism is the answer to that philosophy. Conservatism emphasizes individual agency, purpose, and your capacity to shape your environment through your own labors and even through your own epistemology. And conservatism has very few champions right now. It is a philosophy that lacks a lot of self-confidence. It's not as though it has no takers anymore. It just simply has few champions. And as a result, I think we don't have any philosophy in this country that emphasizes individual personal agency. And that is the remedy to a sense of helplessness and of the perception that you are disempowered. It is seizing power back Right now, they're attempting to seize power back through violence, which is not how you get power back. It's how you get a prison. But it is the remedy to the problem that they think they're struggling with.
Shabbos, I do want to engage this question of whether Kirk was right to handle the Israel debate the way that he did, and the way that you saw him undertake that at TPUSA conferences and elsewhere. What did you make of it?
Certainly. First, let me just compliment everything Noah just said and add that at PragerU, I'm developing a show focused on the intersection between religion and politics. And I want, as we're designing this set, for there to be a quote from Deuteronomy 30:19, because in my opinion, that is the most important quote throughout the entirety of the Hebrew Bible. It's when God tells, or Moses tells the Jewish people that I am placing before you life and death, good and evil, and choose life. And here is the blueprint. Here is the roadmap by which you can make that choice. And that to me is so fundamental because it teaches us really the opposite of DEI, that humans have human agency. Palestinians have human agency. The assassin has human agency. I have human agency. I do not blame, nor can I blame, my life circumstances on external factors, on the system. But I have the agency to make decisions in life. And contrary to what MSNBC and Mehdi Hassan and Ilhan Omar were spewing today, the only blame for Charlie Kirk's assassination is the assassin. You know, people need to understand that you are a consequence of the decisions you make. Take responsibility for your life. This is why I became a conservative. It's because rather than blaming, it makes much more sense to build. And that's what he stood for. Look, in terms of the practicalities, I have criticized Charlie and TPUSA in the past for inviting people like Dave Smith or Tucker Carlson or his friendship with Candace Owens. But at the same time, I wasn't in Charlie's position whereby he's the movement of tens of millions, he's the head of the movement of tens of millions of young people. And in some cases, I believe he had to cater to those young people. And if he didn't bring on those Dave Smiths or Tucker Carlsons, then they would simply leave TPUSA and go to more extreme routes. So I think he was caught between a rock and a hard place. Personally, I'm proud of the fact that, I backed out of the Trump rally at Madison Square Garden that Tucker was speaking at. I do not think that free speech means that you invite actively individuals to your platform, which is why I'm aghast that Temple Emmanuel, for example, has tried 3 separate times to bring Charles Schumer on their panel on anti-Semitism, because certainly Chuck Schumer has free speech. That doesn't mean you are the ones who have to invite him.
Shabbos, he wrote a book. He wrote a whole book on it. He's an
Correct.
expert.
He wrote a book
and Shabbos, again, for a Palestinian senator to write a book about anti-Semitism, that's how we get conversation in America.
Yeah. He wrote a book on how to create anti-Semitism, not confront anti-Semitism.
What-
But what I would say is this: now that Charlie is gone, and I alluded this before, you are going to see, and you've already seen it in the dark corners of Twitter, you're going to see young people, I think, alienate themselves farther and farther from Israel, from supporting the state of Israel, certainly supporting the orchestration of this war. That's why I say Charlie was so unique, because he really bucked the trend in that sense. And I'm deeply concerned about the direction of the conservative movement, in particular, as it pertains to young people. But that's why, as I said earlier, it's never been more important to empower young conservatives who believe in the values that Charlie Kirk espoused. So ultimately, was he right to bring in Dave Smith? Look, he also brought in Josh Hammer, and I thought that was an excellent debate, and it was an excellent opportunity for Josh Hammer to focus on the intellectual holes of someone like Dave Smith and his arguments. So my position, and this is where I'm sort of out of sync with many of the Jewish legacy organizations, is, for example, on a college campus, individuals can and should be allowed to yell Free Palestine and globalize the Intifada. They have a right to express free speech. Now, it happens to be that universities don't agree they have a right to free speech, which is why Harvard was ranked 248th out of 248 American universities when it came to free speech. But the only way you combat bad ideas is with good ideas. It's not by censoring the ideas and pretending the ideas don't exist. This is why, for example, when Nick Fuentes attacked me on social media, I challenged him back by saying, let's debate it. If you are so confident in your opinions, then tell me why I'm wrong. Of course, he's not an intellectual and he didn't agree to it. But point being, Charlie was unique in the sense that he really believed that to its core. And he was actually working, I don't know how public this is, he was working with Jewish nonprofits and influential Jewish Americans behind the scenes, telling them, this is what's wrong with your narrative. This is how you can change. This is how I can help you. Because he felt it to his core that Israel was the canary in the coal mine and was the first line of defense for Western civilization. So my attitude is I detest individuals like Dave Smith and Tucker Carlson. But look, they have more daily listeners than there are Jews on planet Earth. And the only way you will combat those ideas is by telling them why it is they are wrong. That's why I go on Piers Morgan's show. I hate it. I hate being yelled at. I hate being berated. I hate being called a bitch and a Nazi and a baby killer at 9 a.m. But Piers Morgan, as I said, has more weekly listeners than Jews on planet Earth. So for us to cede that territory would be dangerous. And Charlie knew that, which is why uniquely from a very early age and from the early infancy of Turning Point USA, they would often engage in the controversial.
You mentioned Josh Hammer, and I watched that debate myself too. And Josh Hammer made I think, a point to Jewish Insider today that I really do agree with. He basically understood Charlie Kirk as a bulwark against even worse expressions of anti-Semitism. I think he's right about that.
Charlie, people forget this. Charlie called anti-Semitism demonic. I mean, I think even at that debate, he prefaced the debate and closed the debate by saying we can agree and disagree on Israel, but we all must, not should, we must agree that anti-Semitism and the hatred of the Jew has no place in the conservative movement. He also felt, forget about his religious sensitivities, from a political perspective, the conservative, and this is what Noah was suggesting earlier, the conservative believes in building, not blaming. And when you have people like the Nick Fuenteses who constantly feel a need to project their failures on the doings of others, that is not a conservative viewpoint. Is so debilitating. Young people who go to these college campuses like Harvard and Columbia and elsewhere and are told, because of the color of your skin, because of your sexual orientation, you will never be able to succeed, whether it be professionally or academically or socially. Therefore, we either have to artificially lower standards, which is why you have something like affirmative action or DEI, or we have to upend the system, which is why Bernie Sanders and AOC are so popular. And that's where you see the horseshoe theory really at play here when it comes to anti-Semitism, because both the left and the right need to blame others. And Charlie so detested that, both politically as it went against conservatism and biblically, religiously. He really felt in the powers of Genesis, I believe it's chapter 12, verse 3. He really believed that those who bless Israel will be blessed. He really believed that Jews and Christians need to connect to the biblical land of Israel. And that firepower is something that not only will be missed, but because of it, you will see, certainly in 2028 during the primaries, you will see things that were left at the gates being allowed in, things that were on the fringe becoming mainstream. That is what I fear.
So, my friends, we're getting down near the end of our time, but there is zillions of questions from the audience. I want to read a couple of them and get your reactions. Noah and Liel, this one is for both of you, but Noah, will come to you first. This is what the question says: if there's anything that Charlie Kirk modeled, it was debate and the airing of a diverse range of views. We have several questions that are really pushing back on the notion that political violence is an especially left-wing phenomenon. The Pittsburgh shooting, they say, was done by a kind of right-wing anti-Semite. Do those of us on the right and the right of center need to look inward in a more serious way about the risks of violence from our own side?
Yes, 100% yes. No, I think this is a reciprocal phenomenon. It draws and feeds off the actions of the opponents, as I said earlier, justifies violent action by virtue of real or perceived slights by their opponents, be that for the left, that's the state as well as right-wing demonstrators, and for the left, for the right rather, it is generally the left. And we've saw plenty of right-wing violence over the course of the last decade, and I take a backseat to no one in my shock, horror, and condemnation of the January 6 riots. That was to me the sum of all Madisonian fears. And I do believe that the Republican establishment had a role to play in fomenting the delusions to which those rioters were beholden, and you could say individual acts of violence that precede and accompany it. But I do think there's an asymmetry here that would be dishonest to pretend does not exist. That we're simply in a moment in history which is far too redolent of other previous moments in American history, and again, they come about every half century, in which the left outpaces the right in terms of violence. I was having this conversation today with some folks over at Fox, and they're like, remember the late 80s and early 90s, how placid it was, and when the violence stopped? And yeah, it was less assassinations, no assassinations. Certainly a lot less mob violence, although no mob violence. There were race riots and other smaller scale events. But the left does not remember the 80s and 90s as being a time of placid, happiness where everybody got along and there was no political violence. The 90s there was tons of political violence. If you're on the left in the 90s, it was the time of the militia movement. It was the time of Timothy McVeigh, anti-state actors, radical libertarians who are violent libertarians. They'll even see shades of anti-left violence in, for example, the philosophy espoused by the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, because he was anti-leftist. He said in his ramblings that leftism was an opiate, a false way of expressing dissent. And this is how these periods get lost to us in history. In the 1910s and early 1920s, the anarchist violence led by the Italian anarchists and the Galleanists were anti-left. In a way, they were Soviet, they were pro-Soviet, they hung around with Emma Goldman and Nick Berkman, and they blew up the symbols of capitalism. They were anti-left insofar as they thought the left was far too accommodationist, even the Bolsheviks. So that's the sort of thing that allows historians to just skate past this sort of thing. Yes, violence exists on all, political violence, and the motives to conduct political violence exists on all sides. But the intellectual superstructure that supports the kind of violence we're seeing from the left now is just very different from what we have on the right, and it doesn't serve us to pretend otherwise.
Liel, this is the next question. In prior social convulsions, the intelligentsia tried to rein in the passions of romantic revolutionaries through academia, film, journalism, and religion. Do you think we've got sufficient intellectual and cultural infrastructure to provide that kind of limiting force today? We probably don't. And so without it, doesn't that make this time different when people who used to throw water in the past now throw kerosene?
First of all, I do not agree with that characterization. I think to assign any one role to the intelligentsia at large is a deep sin against history. I want to answer by way of plugging into what Noah said, because I think the last sentence that he said is one that I agree with wholeheartedly, which is that we're looking at something different now. I'm saying this and stating this and amplifying this by way of, once again, I'm afraid, disagreeing with my wise friend. And this has to do with the whole notion of the quote unquote question of responsibility. There's a kind of a trope when people talk about Israel and Palestine to use one of the most profoundly idiotic coinages that have entered the English language, the cycle of violence. No lesser mind than Emmanuel Macron, the Napoleon of our time, used this in his official condemnation of whatever the latest Israeli act of self-determination was, saying this is a cycle of violence that must be stopped. You could, if you're of that mindset, say, look, I'm a bookkeeper, and I'm looking here at the ledger, and there are 73 attacks that occurred based on this person's belief in this ideology. There are 62 attacks that occurred based on that person's belief in the other ideology. Therefore, when we tally them all together, at the very least, we could say there are good and bad people on all sides, which, by the way, is a sentiment in America that only very few people could say. I think the reality is much more difficult, and it has, again, to do with the state of where we are and what exactly was encouraged and what was tolerated. The left, for many, 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 many years in this country, controlled entirely what is known among academics as the permission structure, the things you can and cannot say. The entire culture, and this, John, connects to the question that you just asked me, wasn't just kind of reacting to this, it was directing this storm. We have Hollywood films that are not just kind of by decree, but they're propaganda by decree. You now have rules for which kinds of considerations you must have in your movie film if Comrade Film is to win big golden award. You have publishing houses that openly say, we do not publish white writers, white male writers. We do not publish conservative writers. To talk about there being some kind of reciprocity because, oh, hey, I could think of 3 cases in which someone who is vaguely affiliated with the right did something to someone vaguely affiliated with the left is absolute sheer idiocy to my mind. That having been said, Noah is completely right, and it cannot be stressed enough that the likelihood of something terrible happening in this climate from the right is considerable. It is deplorable, and it should absolutely keep all of us awake. Therefore, the best thing that we could do is to nip this entire deranged cultural infrastructure in the bud. And by the way, just because I want to agree with Noah one more time, it is not, as my first comments might have suggested, this kind of great big revolutionary scheme. No, it's completely right. It is just a matter of upholding a bunch of laws and saying, hey, by the way, when you call for the overthrow of the democratically elected government of the United States of America, guess what, buddy? That's sedition, and you go to jail, and I don't care who you are and what you believe. It's a fairly straightforward transaction.
So, my own view is that the role of intellectuals now is exaggerated by intellectuals who come to discussions like this one and think of ourselves at the center of a discussion that we have not no role in, but a marginal role. And I think that the role of intellectuals now is, and teachers, and I think this is one of the things that we try to do in some of our student programs. I think the role of intellectuals now is to build up the antibodies to resist some of the bad ideas that are out there. And the bad ideas come sometimes from other intellectuals, and they are seeded through universities, and they are amplified in that way. But the kind of ambient thoughts that travel through social media very often come from more nefarious actors. And I think that many of them come from foreign actors who have American division as part of their strategic objectives to sow chaos in the United States.
That's
yeah,
correct.
go on, Liel.
No, I think that's completely correct. But I think also, again, I want to stress once more the tremendous amount of hope I have in this nation. We talk about intellectuals, and many of us, like that old Hasidic joke, are like the Jew looking for the penny under the lamplight because it's the only place that's well lit. I think it's important to realize that once you stop looking at intellectuals as people who are accredited by big academic institutions or published by the New Yorker magazine, home of the nefarious liar Malcolm Gladwell, who admitted that he kept his mouth shut about, biological males in women's sports because he was too much of a coward to risk his career. Once you stop understanding that that's what intellectual looks like, then you look around and you find people like the great man whose memory we're honoring today, who are sometimes self-taught, who sometimes come from unexpected corners, but who have a deep burning attachment to ideas, to the greatness and godliness of this country, and for telling the truth. And you see this in so many unexpected corners. I'll give you one example. The fact that while so much of the culture industry has become a complete stranglehold of actual barbarians, and yet at the same time, you see so many rappers who are putting out work that is deeply connected to and engaging with faith, with community, with values that are, traditional to the core, is really a testament, I think, to the greatness of this country and to the fact that, while Harvard, Im Yirtzeh Hashem, Alhamdulillah, will not survive this, America will.
So we're now at time, and I want to just go around and ask each of you to end with some hope, as Liel just did in his own way, his own burning way. Uh, give our listeners and our viewers something that we can do to bring the temperature down and to advance the things that in his most patriotic and civic best Charlie Kirk stood for.
Well, you just said it, didn't you, Jonathan? If we were to truly honor Charlie's legacy, it would be to espouse and to model the behaviors that he advocated, evangelized for. It would be through not tolerant debate, but debate, engagement. It would not be to silence and stifle. It would be to expose and to bring sunlight to, and certainly passion and heat, and by no means equivocation or some sort of erecting some sort of a moral equivalency, which is what we see too often from people who, as the price of admission into polite society, elite society, to countenance ideas that do not deserve to be countenanced. And we could see that. We could very well see that, because I've seen, for all the darkness of this conversation, what have we seen from the real spokespeople for the sectors of society that they represent in the wake of Charlie Kirk's death, apolitical sectors of society? A moment of silence at Yankee Stadium, where the entire crowd was dead silent. People who are in athletics and in elements of academia and entertainment and industry coming out in absolute horror and asking themselves and asking their neighbors and asking generally, is this the kind of country that we want to live in? And concluding, no, it is not. And from that thought, the actions that you would take and the behaviors you would model are virtually instinctual. You don't need to be taught how to not be so mired in your own self, wallowing in your own self-perception, deaf and blind to the world around you, that you get out of it and just engage with the world around them. Quite a lot of this modern wave of violence has to do with individuals descending into themselves and being hyper-focused on themselves and constantly questioning how they feel and what they think and how they're perceived at any given moment. And that'll drive you crazy. It is engagement with the world around us and the creation of real, durable attachments to our communities and our loved ones that ground us and that keep us sane. And that's what we need more of. And we may, contrary to a lot of my instincts towards pessimism right now, we may see a lot more of that than we think.
I can't believe that now almost got me to say something nice about the New York Yankees, but it was indeed a very touching moment. I'd like to again take a variation on the theme that I've been espousing here all evening. You said to bring the temperature down. I'm actually not interested at all in bringing the temperature down. I'm interested in only one thing, and it's a hugely optimistic thing, because it's the only thing, as the Torah teaches us, so eloquently, that wins in the end, which is the truth. Our obligation now is to absolutely resist each and every bullshit narrative that we are being sold. When we are being told, well, speech is violence by some, college commissar, our responsibility is to say, no, it's not. And if you believe that, you have absolutely no business educating anyone, especially the young. And I think, again, that was another, another great lesson that we learned from Charlie Kirk, because though he was deeply respectful, and though he listened to everyone, and though he always tried to find some point of human connection, and you could see this again, if you want to do something good for yourself tonight, go ahead and watch some of these debates. Go watch him talk to a young woman, for example, who's on OnlyFans and makes her money off sleeping with men on camera, and tell her, you are a godly creature. You are more than this. You do not have to demean yourself like this. But still, within all this compassion and kindness and committed to free speech, the one thing he never, ever compromised was telling the truth. And we mustn't either.
Liel has such a good point there, because there's another thing we haven't talked about is commercial pressure. Debate makes money.
Right.
People like watching debate. Remember when cable news used to have actual good faith debate between people who knew what they were talking about? That's when cable news made money. It doesn't make money anymore. because
right.
they're afraid of confronting their audiences with contrary views. They don't think that's what they want anymore.
Right.
And frankly, I think that's commercial pressure alone will put will impose some changes on that media landscape.
Love it.
Shabbos, you honor us with the last word.
Oh, big mistake. What we can learn from Charlie Kirk, I will close the Chabad analogy, which is to say, no one thought that the movement would continue after the Rebbe's passing. Yet today there are 5,000 Chabad houses, not all over the country, all over the world. And today is again not a great comparison, but today is the Gimel Tammuz, is the day of the passing. But I'm so optimistic, not just about the future of conservatism in this country, but of young people being engaged in the political process. Charlie turned on a switch for so many people who were apathetic about politics and activism. I mean, I worked on the Trump campaign. Donald Trump would not have won without Charlie Kirk. States like Arizona or Michigan or Pennsylvania would not have been won without Charlie Kirk. And Liel said something interesting about Harvard, which really got me thinking. One of the greatest lines of Trump's second term was a few months ago when he spoke at the University of Alabama. And he said, the future will not be dictated by the Harvard Crimson, but by the Crimson Tide, right? Why could people relate to Charlie? Because Charlie went to community college and then dropped out after 2 years. And that's what makes Tikva such a remarkable institution. Jonathan did not tell me to say this. I'm saying it because I believe it to be true. Otherwise, I wouldn't be saying it. Because Tikva is not impressed with accolades. They're impressed with attributes. They're not impressed with degrees. They're impressed with dignity. Charlie is not someone who had a fancy diploma or a degree. He did not go to an Ivy League university. He didn't finish college. But look at the movement he created. Look at the things he fought for. And what a uniquely American story that it does not matter your political background. It does not matter about your financial wealth. It does not matter about the college you went to. What matters is the integrity of the individual, of how willing and passionate you are to fight for your ideas. That is how we honor Charlie's memory. And the last point I'll say is the last book he was working on was on how he kept the Sabbath. Charlie actually kept the Sabbath. I don't mean Sunday, I mean like Saturday. And he would encourage not just Jews to keep the Sabbath, which Jews are biblically commanded to do, but for people to keep the Sabbath. Turn off your phone for a 24-hour period. Connect to family. One of the last videos he posted on Twitter was how irrespective of his political successes, the greatest joy in his life was coming home and seeing his two kids. And there will be millions of new young fathers because of Charlie Kirk. There will be millions of new young husbands and wives and kids who are engaged in the political process, who care about American democracy, who champion conservative principles because of some guy who dropped out of community college 10 years ago. What a remarkable story. What a remarkable testament of our country. So I'm incredibly optimistic. I think, as I said in the beginning, we're not going to have future Charlie Kirks because that role can never be filled. But what you will have are individuals in their unique way, with their unique talents, striving to defend American virtues and American ideals. And that is a direct result of what Charlie meant to so many of us.
Alhamdulillah.
I don't think
Noah,
Charlie ever thought we would finish a call talking about him with Alhamdulillah, but there you go.
Noah, Liel, Shabbos, thank you so much for being our teachers tonight and for helping us both remember 9/11 and Charlie Kirk in the same conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, with that, we adjourn.